Now, tonight, the meeting, as we know, is going to focus on Syria and things happening in Syria and the implications of U.S. policy and how it hurts Americans here at home, how it hurts the people overseas, and it's for the benefit of a very few politically connected crony corporatists and warmongers, and is detrimental to everybody else. And so, we are very pleased that the great Scott Horton, you've seen him twice before here recently. He just was he's in Texas now, of course, but he was on the Ron Paul Liberty Report not that long ago. He did that. He does such great work with his radio show, his books. And I want to mention, by the way, Mother's Day is coming up, and Father's Day is coming up. And he wrote a great book called Fool's Errand. Show mom and dad that they didn't raise no fools, because you're going to buy Scott Horton's book, Fool's Errand. It's a great book about Afghanistan, gets rave reviews. And so Scott is here to talk to us about what's been going on regarding the Syrian situation, Netanyahu's nutty song and dance that he just did the other day. I'm not buying any baloney, and Scott's going to tell us what's going on and all of these things here. So, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Scott Horton. And we're all against the next war. Scott, tell us what's happening now.
All right. Well, it's a real complicated mess. Basically, right now, the Americans have carved out a piece of northeastern Syria, which is basically Syrian Kurdistan. So when the war broke out in 2011, and the CIA took the side of the Sunni jihadist insurgency, the Kurds basically took the opportunity to somewhat break away and really carve out a pretty substantial autonomous zone. Now, they never went to war against the central government, and they never officially, seceded from it and repudiated it or anything like that. They just kind of went their own way. But then, of course, Obama's government's support for the jihadists ended up leading to the rise of the Islamic State. And the Islamic State was a breakoff of Al-Qaeda. It's basically Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Iraqi dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because Al-Qaeda in Iraq during Iraq War II had people from all over the Middle East in it. But the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the Syrian war, they broke away from Al-Qaeda, and part of it was just about oil money, and part of it was about doctrine. But, a big part of the split was that Al-Qaeda's strategy has always been to fight the Americans, to bog us down, or whichever enemies, in this case, fight Assad, bog him down, bleed him dry, and just keep fighting and put off trying to establish a caliphate until someday. Because as long as the Americans are in play, they'll never let it last. America's too powerful to take on, so that's why they're trying to bleed us to bankruptcy in the first place. But what the Islamic State did was they stopped following the edicts of Al-Qaeda. And they said, we want to create a caliphate now. And they created a state in eastern Syria at first, and then eventually in 2014, they ended up conquering western Iraq. So at that point, Obama's policy of supporting these jihadis had gotten completely out of control. And so then they launched Iraq War III to try to reverse it. Now, in Iraq, that meant fighting with the Shiite majority government and the Shiite militias and the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga forces against the Islamic State. And in Syria, it meant embedding special operations forces and Marines with these Syrian Kurds and using them as the proxy force to fight against the Islamic State, the one that was immediate blowback from the previous year's policy. So now the Islamic State is virtually defeated. They've been rousted out of all their real territorial strongholds and so forth. I think they have a couple of little territories left where they're being kept. But mostly they're either killed or scattered to the winds. But so now there's a real problem, because Iran and Hezbollah have come, along with the Russians, to help the Assad government to defeat these jihadists that they are fighting as well. And now So from the Americans' point of view, this is the world's worst crisis, because the whole reason that they supported the jihadists in the first place was to try to take out Assad, which they figured would weaken Iran. And that was the whole point. Barack Obama said this to the Atlantic magazine in 2012 to Jeffrey Goldberg. They talk about, yeah, that'd be a great way to bring Iran down a peg, right? And Obama even jokes in a way almost, I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you. He says, I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I can't tell you everything we're doing. Your clearance isn't high enough. But they talk about that's the whole point, is to try to weaken Iran, because Syria is the only Arab government that's an ally of Iran, ruled as it is by the Alawite minority in alliance, which is sort of a break-off of Shiism, and in alliance with the Shiite Arabs and the Christians as well there. And so, and the Druze, for that matter. So anyway, the whole point of this operation was to try to weaken Iran's influence. Well, it didn't work. They completely lost Western Iraq for 3 years and had to launch a whole new war for the Shia again, for Iran's side in Iraq, again, to make up for that blunder. And so all they've done is empower Iran again in Iraq War III, in Iraq, and in Syria. So now they want to stamp their feet and cry and say it's not fair that Iran is gaining in power and influence all over the region. And you got to understand why this really bothers the Americans, because Iran, is Persia. It's a huge independent power on the, eastern periphery of the Arab world there. And they used to be America's sock puppet, and we really liked it that way. The U.S. empire really liked having the Shah there. And so now they can't stand that since 1979, Iran has been independent from our empire. And they are America's rival for dominance in the region. It's not that they're Saudi's rival. They're America. The middle part of North America is the rival with the Persians for who will be the dominant power in the Middle East. And everything Uncle Sam, a.k.a. George W. Bush and Barack Obama, do makes these men more and more powerful. So now, last February, just a couple months ago, February, Donald Trump said, we're only in Syria to fight ISIS. And Rex Tillerson came out 2 days later, 3 days later, and basically said, belay that order. Never mind what the president says. That's not right. We are in Syria to limit the power of Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian government. And so not only was he contradicting the president there, but in fact, that was used by the president of Turkey, Erdogan, as an excuse to attack the Syrian Kurds, who are the enemies of our NATO allies, the Turks. And in fact, there's a part of Syrian Kurdistan, which would be in the far west of Syrian Kurdistan, which is sort of in the middle of the country of Syria, where this area did not have American Marines embedded with them. They were kind of out further. This is a town called Afrin in a region called Afrin. And it was a place that was protected by Russian air power previously. So Erdogan, after Rex Tillerson gave his talk, Erdogan went to Putin and said, aha, you see that? The Americans announced they're staying forever. They're carving out eastern Syria. They're going to protect the Syrian Kurds. And so we want to attack the Syrian Kurds. And Putin, seeing an opportunity to pit two NATO nations against each other, is like, yeah, sure. And so, or not really pit, but cooperate with the NATO allies pitting themselves against each other. So Russia pulled their air cover back from Afrin and let the Turks invade Syria outright and attack. And the Turks even brought a bunch of Al-Qaeda guys into their ranks to do it, and they committed war crimes while they were at it, butchering and dismembering the bodies of at least one female Kurdish fighter that they had captured. And I think more than that. Anyway, so now now America, and they moved as far as Manbij, the town of Manbij, which I think is right on the other side of the Euphrates River. And so now the Americans and the Turks are literally nose to nose, where America is embedded with these Syrian Kurds, the avowed enemies of our allies, the Turks. And the Turks really hate and fear these guys because they are the allies of the Turkish Kurdish radical group, the PKK. And so that's the mess we find ourselves in, where at any point the Americans can complain how bad the situation is and ignore the fact that it's all their fault.
Well, yes, the U.S. government, once again, either unintended or intended consequences rear their ugly head. And wasn't there, I want to make a quick announcement here. We have a former congressman who's running again for election to a seat, Kerry Bentivolio from our 11th Congressional District. And Kerry's a U.S. war veteran, and he was over there in the Middle East. And we also have, in our 9th Congressional District, where I live, Scott, Candace Stearns, who's running for U.S. Congress. They're both running as Republicans, and they would both be excellent improvements over the current occupants of those offices. And I'm reminded, as you're talking about the situation with the Americans and the Turks facing each other in Manbij, that for a while, maybe this is still happening, the Turks were flying airplanes from Incirlik Air Base to bomb the Kurds, and from the same air base, the American Air Force was flying planes to supply the Kurds that were on the American side. So it is truly a real mess. And then just the other day, it was amazing. The president saying, it looks like it's all pretty much wrapped up over there now, and then it looks like we can get out. And then there's one of these, what certainly appears to anyone rational and logical, one of these false flag situations, very suspicious, where they try to accuse the Assad government of gassing civilians in what would be one of the world's great strategic blunders. It had no military value. They're winning the war, and then we find out from independent journalists like Robert Fisk and others who go there, and that one fellow Pearson, I think, from the One American Network, and there were some other people who went there and said it looks like there probably wasn't even a chemical attack, and yet the administration immediately jumped on this before they could have even known what had actually happened. Then the missiles get thrown at Syria, and some people like Paul Craig Roberts and others, as you know, Paul are saying, or Scott are saying, hey, it looks like we're not only having a problem in Syria, but are certain people and certain governments trying to stir up a war and to drag the United States into the middle of it between, say, Israel and Iran or something of that nature. What are your thoughts on that, Scott?
Well, I think probably Israel won't just start a war and try to drag the United States into it, but they may well get an agreement from Donald Trump to do so. I mean, I guess I'm not predicting that, to tell you the truth, but you're right that it's a real problem. I think Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Mattis clearly recognized the problem here, and that's why the strikes that they did were so limited. It was really a replay of a year ago where they kind of shake their finger and they pretend to believe in the chemical weapons story for the sake of argument, and then they shoot a few cruise missiles and don't have too much effect. So thank God for that, right? I mean, they could have changed the policy back to regime change and said, no, we're again intent on getting rid of Assad, which is what Tillerson has said. And I think that's I hope that's why he got fired, was over that. And then, like you said, Trump said again, no, we're just there for ISIS. And they keep trying to pull him back in. And I agree with you. I think this latest chemical attack looks like a publicity stunt, that these people were suffocating in the tunnels being bombed down there from smoke and dust and whatever. And then the white helmet Al-Qaeda PR firm basically came up with this, let's exaggerate this into a chemical attack. Now, I don't know exactly the truth of exactly what happened there, but that's sure what it looks. Certainly, they have not earned the benefit of the doubt from us, but in fact, quite the opposite when it comes to that kind of thing. And by the way, what law says America gets to attack your country if you use chemical weapons in putting down some civil war, especially when it's the fault of the USA for backing these Al-Qaeda guys in the first place? And in the case of Duma, it's Jaish al-Islam, which is not exactly Al-Qaeda, but there's the same difference, just with different leadership who, are in competition together. But but they're, virtually bin Ladenites in terms of their war crimes that they commit and the rest of their ideology and the rest of that. So, and you talked about, one air base in Turkey with the Americans and the Turks flying out of it on opposite sides of this war. We've had this kind of all along in the war, where you had CIA-backed jihadists who were fighting the DOD-backed Kurds a couple of times over the past few years. And then you have the Hazaras, who, this is the part that really gets me. Hazaras, who are part of the coalition that America has backed in Afghanistan for the last 16 years. Well, they're Shiites. And so they have been going to fight on the side of Hezbollah and Assad and Iran against the jihadists. But meanwhile, you have guys who are Afghan Taliban or Afghan, like Pashtun Mujahideen, Taliban or not exactly, but that's what we would call them in Afghanistan if they were fighters there. And then they travel to Syria to fight on the CIA side with the jihadists against Assad and Hezbollah. And so, it just goes on and on. People might remember there was that tragic attack in, I guess it was in 2016, where it was Army Rangers, but working for the CIA on a CIA mission, training these jihadists at a base in Jordan, and then they got friendly fired to death. Insider green on blue attack, and as one of the guys that they were working with there shot them in the back, killed 3 of them, or one in the back was at a checkpoint. Actually, you can watch the video of it. It's pretty bad. Looks like a movie shootout as these guys got ambushed by the people that they're working with there. As Donald Trump used to complain about in Afghanistan, what are we doing fighting this war when the people that we're training up to be the army shoot our guys in the back for training them? What the hell are we doing? Which is a really good question, but he hadn't asked that since he became president, unfortunately.
Right. Well, last night, and speaking of that, last night, Tucker Carlson, who's had some very good segments regarding Syria, apparently he interviewed Colonel Douglas McGregor, and they were talking about the situation regarding Iran, and they both reached the conclusion that there would be absolutely no benefit to the United States for Americans to have a war with Iran. And then other people have been raising a lot of points about the press conference that Prime Minister Netanyahu had, questioning that and saying, well, there was really no information there. In fact, it was very misleading. And then others, Sheldon Richman and others are pointing out, who's got the nuclear weapons program in the Middle East? There is a country that rogue nuclear weapons program. They've got quite a few of them, but it's not Iran. How does that fit into all of this, Scott? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it comes down to it, this is why the Pentagon really does not want to have a war with Iran. And Dick Cheney was really trying hard with Ehud Olmert in 2007 to start one. And the commander of CENTCOM at the time was an admiral named Fallon. And he basically, publicly leaked out that over his dead body, were they going to start a war with Iran? That he was basically going to obstruct the president of the United States and the vice president in their push. And at that point, it's funny because they actually dropped the nuclear scare line for a little while at the beginning of 07, and they replaced it with this ridiculous lie that everybody somehow knows that no Iraqi Shiite could possibly be capable of making his own bomb. So anytime a bomb goes off in a Shiite part of Iraq, we know that bomb, that EFP, explosively foreign penetrator bomb, must have come from Iran. And how do we know? Because Michael Gordon, who lied us into war in Iraq with Judith Miller in the New York Times in the first place, says so. And he says so over and over again. And Petraeus says so. And they never proved it because it wasn't true. And in fact, there's dozens of pieces of journalism that show that these bombs were in fact being made by Arabs, not Persians, in Iraq, not Iran. And that was all lies. But anyway, they were trying to pretend that everything wrong in Iraq was Iran's fault when it was Bush who got rid of Saddam for them and who took the side of the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council that Iran favored. So how do you blame that on Iran when you're the one doing it? Anyway, so the military didn't want to do it. And as Gareth Porter reported at the time, the Air Force was happy to do it, and the Navy probably would have, but the Army and the Marine Corps said no, because they're the ones who got to do all the dying in a war like that. And even to take out the anti-aircraft, you have to send in special operations forces on the ground. And in a country like Iran, that is a huge task. And the Army and the Marines basically bucked and said, we do not want to do this. Even we're talking just just an air war. They did not want to do it, and they basically quashed it. And then, of course, by the way, they also had, and the Navy ought to have been thinking of this too, is the Army and the Marines, especially though, had more at that time, but still to this day, I guess tens of thousands of American personnel within rocket range of the Iranians. So they can hit our guys embedded with Iraqi forces. And then, of course, all our bases in Kuwait, in Qatar, where we have a massive air base, in Bahrain, where we keep the Fifth Fleet. And then, of course, all kinds of economic targets all up and down the Persian Gulf coast there, across the Persian Gulf, where they can hit Saudi and UAE and Bahrain and whatever targets that they can there. So all that's up for grabs. And of course, we still got our guys at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and bases down in Helmand Province. Again, they sent the Marines back to Helmand. So all these guys are right there within range of Iranian retaliation. Plus, of course, Hezbollah they can't invade, but they can fire rockets at northern Israel, which is, a deterrent there. So we ought to be deterred. They have a credible conventional deterrent force only because we ring their country with our bases, right? They can't hit North America. They can never threaten us in a million years, but they are a competition for dominance in the Middle East. And so not that they can attack our positions anywhere in any offensive measure, but they can, hold them hostage and blackmail in a defensive fashion in that way. And then when it comes to Netanyahu's speech, of course, yes, the whole thing. Look, if Netanyahu is claiming something, go ahead and don't believe it for a while until you find out later that, yeah, you were right not to. This is a guy who doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. And you know what? There's a journalist named Nima Shirazi who showed that Netanyahu personally, literally, has been warning about Iranian nuclear weapons since 1986, 85. Literally for decades, this guy has been saying Iran is just a couple of years away from a nuclear bomb, when in fact, they never were making a nuclear bomb. Okay, so now, as far as his presentation the other day, all of it was old stuff. All of it was the alleged studies, which is the smoking laptop and plus another set of documents that the IAEA already completely and totally investigated. Now, the IAEA took them at face value and said, okay, these are legitimate documents. Let's investigate this. And what it amounted to was an Iranian research program to look into making nuclear bombs. It does not amount to a nuclear weapons program or a nuclear bomb program to make one. It amounted to looking into a project, looking into it. But then we don't even have to worry about that because, in fact, two things. First of all, the CIA and the Mossad, the Israeli Mossad themselves, are on the record agreeing that this research stopped in 2003. As soon as George Bush got rid of Saddam for them, they were like, okay, well, now we don't even need to worry about it anymore. Of course, they could never compete in a nuclear fashion with America or Israel. Maybe they could use an atom bomb to keep Saddam out. But at this point, because America might ask Saddam to invade again, like Jimmy Carter did back in 1980. But so once George Bush did what they wanted and got rid of Saddam, they quit even looking into it. And then the second point is that actually Gareth Porter proved that the smoking laptop is an Israeli forgery anyway. And the rest of the alleged studies documents are basically all worst case scenario interpretations of the importation of dual use equipment that actually turned out really did have legitimate purposes. And they said, these magnets must be for a centrifuge and these things must be for that. But later the IAEA investigated and showed that no, actually those magnets are sitting right here on the table at the university doing their totally benign work that they said that they were buying them for in the first place, and on down the line like that. And all this is in the book, Manufactured Crisis, The Truth Behind the Iran Nuclear Scare by Gareth Porter. And so which has been out since early 2015, or maybe even late 2014. And so all Netanyahu did was bring up a bunch of stuff that, one, doesn't say what he says it says, that it puts Iran in violation of something, when all it says is that they looked looked into what it would take to make a nuclear bomb back before 2003, and when in fact all those documents are basically, I don't know every single one of them, but the core of those documents are fake anyway, and none of them actually amount to an Iranian intention to make a nuclear bomb.
And Scott, I think you've pointed out, as Gareth has, the IAEA's reports after their inspections, that they continue to report the non-diversion, or they did the non-diversion of any nuclear material for
and that always has been the case, right? Yeah. Now, as I know, you know, Dennis, the Iranians have been under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and their safeguards agreement with the IAEA all along, right? What's new is this 2015 joint JCPOA plan of action thing. I forgot what this is. Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action here. And so not only have they been verified to still have all of their uranium accounted for, and none of it diverted to any military or other special purpose, as they always have, but 11 times so far they have done their reports that come out saying that Iran is living up to every aspect of the Iran deal. And you know what? As long as we're talking about that, the president constantly, and since he started campaigning on this, constantly says, oh, it's the worst deal ever. What a bad deal. Bad deal. Deal, bad, bad, bad. I hate it, and you should hate it, and we should hate it, and what a bad deal it is. But he never talks about what is in the deal. The only thing he'll ever talk about that's in the deal is we gave them money. They got money. And a lot of times he'll even say they got money in a deliberately vague way, like Bill Clinton might do. Like, well, what do you mean they got money? Well, it was their money. It wasn't our taxpayer money. It was literally money that Jimmy Carter stole from them after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, right around the time he was hiring Saddam to invade and, kill 1 million people, or half or so. And that money was meant to buy weapons from American weapons firms, of course. And the Americans had seized it, and it was some tens of millions of dollars. And there was actually it wasn't the World Court, but it was some other international court, had actually just finished ruling that the Americans have to give them their money back for that. And so this is the deal that John Kerry worked. I hate giving John Kerry credit for anything, right? But literally, John Kerry worked this deal where, hey, Iranians, you know that money that we have to give you back anyway, that belongs to you, that we stole from you, and that we have to give you back anyway? Well, that's the money you get as the deal. In the deal. And they were like, okay. That was the American. That's the worst deal in all history. Is we gave them the money that we stole from them, that we had to give them back anyway, and we said, and this is what you're going to take as your bribe, part of the deal. And they were like, all right, fine. All right. So, but Donald Trump goes, cash. I heard him the other day. I saw him on TV going, cash. They got all this cash. Can you believe it? Money, stacks of it. Like, money piled on top of other money in a big stack. And he's just like fascinated by the idea that there was this pallet with cash on it, but without any of the context of what any of it even means. And here's something that, of course, he never addresses, and that the war party hardly ever addressed. The only people who ever address this would be like in Commentary magazine, and then even then they're just lying their asses off, but at least they get detailed. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he never acknowledges that Iran had to give up things to get that money and to get the sanctions lifted, which they only kind of partially got lifted anyway. Iran had to bend over backwards. And in fact, what Iran did was they poured concrete into their heavy water reactor and destroyed it forever. They reduced the number of spinning centrifuges at Natanz by 2/3. They turned them all off at the Fordo secondary enrichment facility. They shipped out the vast majority of their uranium to Russia and or France to convert it to fuel rods, so they could never even continue enriching it to a higher grade, even if they wanted to, so that they now have like 3% of their uranium stockpile that they used to have. They don't have enough enriched uranium at a low percentage that even if they reprocessed it and enriched it to weapons grade to even make a single nuke, not by a long shot. They've got a much smaller amount than ever before. They gave that whole built-up amount of enriched uranium away, which was still, again, only 3.6%, not weapons grade 90+% U-235, but still it was enough that if they had further enriched it, it could have been a bomb. And then they also expanded the inspections far beyond what they had under the Safeguards Agreement. They signed an additional protocol, and they signed what are called subsidiary arrangements and subsidiary agreements, they're called, to their Safeguards Agreement, which allow the IAEA to do random inspections whenever they want, unannounced, at all nuclear facilities where they have cameras and sensors everywhere anyway. And they can also even investigate non-nuclear facilities where nuclear material is not being introduced in any machines in any way, including centrifuge facilities where there's no nuclear material at all, or even the mines where they're digging the uranium ore out of the ground in the first place. They already have the ability to monitor where they reprocess that into the yellow cake, and where they reprocess the yellow cake and convert that into gas and everything. All of that is already monitored. And then also, and this is the crybaby stuff you'll hear at Commentary Magazine, and they pretend like this is a real criticism. They say, well, the inspectors can't just march right into the front door of any Iranian military base in the whole country and look at whatever they want. So therefore, there could be a secret hidden nuclear something somewhere, and you can't prove that there's not, basically. But of course, that's insane. And if any international organization tried to say that they had the right to march right into an American military base without asking, we go to war against them. I mean, give me a break. No one has a deal like that. But check out the deal the Americans did get, that John Kerry did get. The deal says that if the Americans have evidence that they can provide to the Iranians and to the other members of the UN Security Council, although not as members of the Security Council, but just America and our allies, basically Britain, France, and Germany, and then, of course, there's Russia and China as well. But all we have to do is convince a majority of that group of countries that the evidence is a means for reasonable suspicion, lower than probable cause, reasonable suspicion, for them to go and look. And so that means that even if Russia and China disagree, it doesn't matter. All America has to do is convince the Germans, the French, and the British that our evidence is good enough for a search warrant here. And then if the Iranians try to resist that, then the sanctions automatically snap right back into place immediately. Because John Kerry said to them, look, I can't go home with anything less than that. I can't. That's the way it's got to be, is that it's got to be easy as hell for me to argue that I have a reason to inspect your military facilities. And the Iranians accepted that. They said, if you can provide something, and if you can provide enough that it satisfies the French and the British and the Germans, then that'll be good enough to come to our military bases. And then Donald Trump goes, oh yeah, this is the worst deal in the world. We got nothing for it, and they got all this money. And it's just a lie. It's just wrong. I mean, the deal took a safeguarded civilian nuclear program, and it safeguarded it past the nth degree. So that's it. You can't argue with that unless you're just bluffing.
Okay. Well, and Scott, one last thing here. Saudi Arabia. How does Saudi Arabia fit into this whole situation, both regarding Iran and also Syria? And you know, we hear all these things about Iran, but how does like the civil liberty situation in Saudi Arabia compare to some of these other countries? And how are the Christians doing in Saudi Arabia? Oh, I guess there aren't any, right? Because that's illegal there. Well, I say versus the Christians in Iran. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, try to read the Saudi opinion polls. They don't really have those. Saudi Arabia, of course, is a totalitarian dictatorship run by a royal family who lords it over everybody else, and you know, have a compromise with the religious authorities that they'll frighten everybody with hell if they step out of line or whatever it is, so that they can, you know, spend all their money on cocaine and giant boats and having fun in the south of France and whatever is their thing. It's insane. It's like one of the most corrupt situations, corrupt aristocracies in world history. Now, Iran has plenty of problems. I mean, Iran is very America-like in the way that their police run wild and do whatever they want. People get the death penalty who don't deserve it, and all kinds of things. But it's nothing like the tyranny of Saudi Arabia. At least they do have regular elections. They do have a parliamentary system and a rule of law. It's called an Islamic Republic, and it's not just a ridiculous front like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is no such thing at all. But Iran really is a republic, although a very flawed one. But then again, look who's talking. Now Saudi's problem here is everybody's problem, and that's George Bush. Ronald Reagan and George Bush's father supported, and Jimmy Carter before them, supported Saddam against Iran, and so did Saudi and UAE and Kuwait supported Saddam against Iran to contain this Shiite Iranian revolution of 1979. And this was part of what the first Iraq War was about. Was Saddam invaded Kuwait in a dispute over war debts that he owed them, and yet the oil price was so low he couldn't pay them back, and they were adding insult to injury by overproducing from shared oil wells at the border region there. And so that was, the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War is what led to Iraq War I and the invasion of the invasion of Kuwait, and then the American occupation of Saudi to drive Iraq back out again. But then George W. Bush, well, there's just two things that happened here. Bush Jr. got it in his head that his father would have, and probably correctly, his father would have won re-election in 92 if he had gone all the way to Baghdad and we'd been in the middle of fighting a terrible war in Iraq at the time of the re-election. Because, in fact, the war was won in early 1991, and so he still had a year and a half to go before the election, and the whole glory of winning the war had already worn off by then, and he lost to Bill Clinton. So George W.'s idea was you got to be in the middle of a war, and that's how you make sure to get a second term, so you can try to gangsterize and, quote, privatize Social Security and all this kind of thing he wanted to do in his second term, which thankfully didn't work, but still. And so this was his idea and Karl Rove's idea. And then you had Dick Cheney, who needed to make money for Halliburton because he drove their company into the ground when he was the CEO of it. So he needed to put them on the Army contract dole and pay them back. And then you had Donald Rumsfeld, who had an ideology about transforming the military into this light, fast machine of air power and special operations forces that can do 10 regime changes a year and go around and do whatever they want and this and that. And then you had the neocons. And the neocons are basically, and they have other ideologies, but more or less they put Israel first. And they were determined to smash the Iraqi state. But, and that's not even really right. I think some of them thought of it that way. But really the guys in charge, Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, who were the really ringleaders of the neocons inside the government, they had been convinced by Ahmed Chalabi. Do y'all remember him? The leader of the Iraqi exiles, the Iraqi National Congress. And these were all the exiles that came up with all of the nasty lies about the chemical weapons and the biological weapons and all this stuff, curveball and all this stuff. These were the Iraqi exiles. And what they told the neocons was that if we get rid of Saddam and the Sunni minority dictatorship in Iraq and empower the Shiite supermajority, that they will, with Chalabi in the lead, they will become a very America-friendly and even Israel-friendly country. And in fact, it'll be such a successful Western-style democracy with all the new wonderful freedom that is going to happen for the Iraqi Shia there, that they are going to have the power to then lord it over Iran. And they will be able to pressure the Iranian people into overthrowing their government for us and installing a pro-American government, because they'll be embarrassed that the Iraqi Shia have it so much better than them under this new democracy or whatever. And Paul Wolfowitz bought this, that if we empower the Iraqi Shia supermajority, this will weaken Iran. And of course, Paul Wolfowitz is an idiot. And in fact, what happened was the exact opposite. And what George Bush did was he fought a war for Iran's best friends, the Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party. That was what Iraq War II was, a civil war on behalf of the Shia. And America fought on the side of the Shia the whole time, just like they did again in Iraq War III. But so, to the Saudis, is, well, this is everything. In fact, it's in the WikiLeaks that the king of Saudi Arabia, after the war, said to George Bush, I don't understand. It was always you and us working and Saddam together to contain Iran. And now you've handed Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. And that's their idiom. I found out recently he didn't get the American idiom wrong. We say silver platter, they say golden platter. But anyway, you handed Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. And I don't know what George Bush allegedly responded to that. I don't think it was in there. But so that was what happened. So now, and this has got to always be everybody's frame of reference when we talk about what's going on in the Middle East. Here's what's always the answer to what's going on in the Middle East. George Bush's Iraq War II, George Bush Jr.'s Iraq War II, 2003 through 10, empowered the Iranians and their Shiite allies in Iraq. And then everything they've done ever since is to try to make up for that fact and to try to apologize to Saudi and make it up to Saudi. But of course, Saudi doesn't field infantry. The Saudi shock troops are Al-Qaeda guys. So when we support the Saudis' agenda in the Middle East, it means supporting the al-Nusra Front in Syria against Assad, who are loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher in New York City, the suicide bombers, the Al-Qaeda guys. And so this is why we have our government committing high treason, backing the Al-Qaeda guys, the only enemies of the actual American people who shed American civilian blood by the thousands, right? And American soldiers' blood in Iraq War II as part of the Sunni-based insurgency there. Our government has allied with them, the American people's enemies, against the Iranians. And then, of course, like we were saying from the beginning here, everything they've done to try to hurt the Iranians has only empowered them more and more, just like it's only empowered Al-Qaeda more and more. And who's lost in all this? The Americans. You know, maybe the Israelis have won if you think that having Syria in total chaos and disruption is a victory for Israel, but I don't. I mean, the Israelis actually were ready to negotiate with Assad at different times and absolutely should have. In fact, at one point, George W. Bush stopped them from having a final peace settlement with Assad back in 2006 or so. The ruiner of all things good, that guy. So, you know, absolutely we'd have been better off if they'd never done Iraq War II. But, you know, George W. Bush gets all the blame for the rise of ISIS, which is true. ISIS could have never taken over Western Iraq if it hadn't have been for George W. Bush, because Saddam and Uday and Qusay would have killed them, right? But, no, it was really all Obama's fault. It was the war in Syria and the support for the jihadis in Syria that blew back into Iraq. That was the creation of ISIS. It wasn't that he pulled troops out of Iraq. It was that he used the CIA to support the suicide bombers in Syria.
All right. Well, Scott, once again, that's a really enlightening analysis. It's a lot of bad news, but now we're all smarter, no more than we did earlier. And you tell it in a really great way. And I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. Not only your scholarship, but your moral courage, because I've known you through your communication now for years in various ways. And you have never stopped being a truth teller. You have never stopped picking up your cross of telling the truth, no matter what the consequences. And I think you deserve a big round of applause from everybody here and a lot of support. And thank you for everything that you're doing, sir.
Thanks very much, Dennis, and all of you guys. I really appreciate you having me very much.
Well, I almost forgot. June 21st. June 21st, right? We can take a field trip and go to the Michigan Peace and Liberty Conference. And, of course, that's over in the Jackson, Michigan area. Scott's going to be there. He'll only be there for one day, because then he's going to go to Pork Fest in New Hampshire. But we get to meet the great Scott Horton live, and I got to meet him once at Ron Paul's 80th birthday a few years ago. That was great. But he'll be there speaking, and so we'll send out information about that. It'll be a nice day for us to all go out there and hang out with Scott and Lou Feen and all that gang. So it's a real opportunity. So once again, Scott, thank you very, very much. All the best to you and Larissa and your baby daughter, a little girl. Thank you very much, and you keep up the great work, sir.
Hey, thank all you guys again. Really appreciate it a lot.
Okay, you're welcome.